it's a pleasure. This is an awesome group and an awesome mix for us to listen to today. Pallav Jain is with McKinsey, has a fascinating background and certainly an honored undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from IIT and in Indian Institute of Technology, which is no easy venue to attend. And then he received a master's in chemical engineering at Rice University, and one might think then that was clearly a career path trajectory towards engineering pathway. And he did work with Bechtel and somewhat in that industry, and then went into, unfortunately, get an MBA at Duke University. You know, but we forgive him that, and we think he can overcome that in his life as well. He has an extraordinary background in the industry, and certainly as one who has been teaching in the MBA community, we always appreciate folks with engineering or science and military backgrounds coming into the MBA programs. They often add a special dimension to it. So it's a great pleasure to have us hear first from Pallav Jain from McKinsey.
So actually, building on Ben's point, essentially what I'm going to talk about today is the wireless industry at an unstable equilibrium. And like Ben mentioned, you know, the industry has gone through a lot of disruption, but when we look forward, there's a potential for even bigger disruptions. We think there are opportunities here. We think there are opportunities here for incumbents to hold on to their position, but also significant opportunities for new attackers. So rather than give you a viewpoint as to what's going to happen, what I'll give you is actually 4 forces that will preserve stability and the incumbents and the position of incumbents today, and 4 forces that will lead to disruption and redistribution of wealth. So before that, let me just quickly kind of recap where we are. If you look back, essentially the wireless industry has significantly outperformed the GDP. We have, if you look at the US wireless industry, the EBIT has grown at around 11% in the last 5 years. The revenues have grown at 11%. The EBIT has grown about 15%. When you look at across the value chain, what you find is the performance has been different by different components of the value chain. So a lot of the growth in the last 5 years has actually been realized by the component manufacturers and the device manufacturers, which is all led to, driven by the penetration of smartphones. The carriers have done relatively well, but the network infrastructure players have performed significantly worse. The other thing that when we look at this, what we find is, if you look at the top bars, there's actually significant concentration of wealth. In each of those parts of the value chain, the top 2 players represent about 60 to 80% of the total profit pools that are in that value chain. And so essentially what has happened is, you know, the industry has done well, except the network infrastructure players. And 2 players typically in each portion of the value chain have actually captured majority of the profits. So then, if you think about going forward, how is this story going to play out? The first challenge that presents itself is, when you look at where the future source of growth could come from, actually what you find is, historically growth has been driven by increase in number of devices and lines, and increase in device ASPs. But when you look forward, in fact, if you look at last 5 years, all the growth is explained by those 2 factors, almost all. But if you look forward, these 2 factors will represent only 5% CAGR. So essentially, only 5% of growth is going to come from these factors. This is what we would call organic growth, right? We think there is about $85 billion of additional revenues. So just to put it in perspective, the 5% organic growth would be like $45 billion of revenue pool. We think there is about $85 billion of additional revenues that are going to be created in new areas, and that's what is going to cause a potential for disruption, because the key question is, who's going to capture those? So then let me very quickly give you a view of why the incumbents would, the 4 arguments for why the incumbents would hold on and capture majority of this incremental value. One is spectrum position. If you look at the top 2 carriers in the US, their spectrum, from a low frequency spectrum perspective, the most advantageous spectrum, they have 80% of it. So they're positioned better. Second is pricing structure. As you think about data, data share plans and those pricing paradigms, they inherently benefit the incumbents because they have the higher wallet share to start with. And so over time, when we actually look at our proprietary consumer surveys, we think there are about 12 million lines that are non-AT&T or Verizon that are at risk because of these data share plans over time. Number 3 is what we call privileged access to components. What you will find is, in the last 5 years, because the wealth has got concentrated among the component manufacturers and the device manufacturers and top 2 players, Samsung and Apple in devices, Samsung and Qualcomm in components, a lot of the OEMs have reduced their R&D spend. The R&D spend for the other OEMs have come down by as much as 30%. And what Apple and Samsung have done a great job of is actually Samsung vertically integrating and Apple using a virtual supply chain by having its suppliers actually do R&D for it. They have actually basically created a virtual access to the best components and basically locked up the supply chain. That again favors the incumbents. And then the last piece is platform loyalty and ecosystem scale advantage. I think the simple point here is, as you think about the platforms, iOS or Android, they have the scale advantage, and they have the two-sided network advantage. Both the developers like to develop on them because of the scale of customers who adopted them, and the customers care about them because of the developers who like to develop for them. And so these are all the forces that actually help the incumbents capture most of the margins going forward. Now let's talk about what are the forces that actually could lead to disruption. The first force is the subsidy models don't work anymore. The carrier margins are getting compressed, and hence the carriers are trying to find alternate subsidy models. What you're also finding is some of the low-end carriers are using low-end devices from ZTE, Huawei, etc. And basically, that has become about 44% of their portfolio. So over time, what you will find is the subsidy model is going to change, and hence the premium smartphone players, while they might hold on to their position, the mid-end OEMs, their margins will get compressed. The second thing is outlook on data pricing. As the tier data pricing plans are being adopted, what you're finding is heavy users are actually don't like these plans as much. And if you talk to these users, who represent about $10 billion of the services revenues in the industry, they are about 3x more likely to churn. And what that means is carriers who are more value-oriented, have a play for these customers. The third thing is shifting sources of innovation, and what we mean by that is, in the argument for incumbents winning, I told you that Apple and Samsung have privileged access to certain components. Well, other players are getting the hang of that game, and so you're seeing Microsoft, Amazon, and other players actually doing the same, playing the same game, where they're trying to lock up the supply chain, and hence new players are coming in to actually get the privileged access to components. And then the last piece that we think will cause a big disruption is that there are new devices that are going to represent about $25 billion of revenues over the next 3 to 5 years. These are sensors, these are goggles, these are all devices that are manufactured by OEMs that are not the OEMs who manufacture smartphones today. And hence that profit pool can potentially be captured by other players. In addition, when we look at the apps marketplace, what we see is the apps as they exist today, only 1% of apps represent 80% of revenues that are generated by all the app players. Because the winners have figured out a way to kind of dominate those markets. When we look forward, we think the whole app market is going to change significantly. The apps are going to be much more about disrupting retail, healthcare, other adjacent value chains. And that will create opportunity for new platform players, new device manufacturers to capture that opportunity. So essentially, net-net, the way we think about the world is there's actually overall $130 billion of value at stake, $45 billion of organic value, and $85 billion of new value. In terms of who captures it, it's up in the air. The incumbents are positioned well because of certain factors, but those advantageous positions may not translate well in the future because where the growth is going to come from, those apps, sensors, devices, and those subsidy models may not work as well in the future. That's kind of our perspective on this.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly wholeheartedly agree. We've paid often little attention in looking on mobility to the rapidly exploding dimension of machine-to-machine communications, and even though, as of a few years ago, we have and forever will have more devices and people growing in this space, communicating, and clearly one of the questions for us to think about is that apportionment of rapidly growing volume associated with video and audio sound activities and correlated with the bursty communications that takes place especially in the machine world as well. So we've heard from Pallav on, next we're going to hear from Dan Littmann,